So short-term interest rate less than 1 year was quite low, was low enough in the economy, and banks had cash and banks were willing to lend for less than a year. But RBI wanted that long-term interest rates should come down in the economy to support growth. A very important term is related to this chapter is Operation Twist. Operation Twist. Now, this term is not so simple as you understand. It's very technical and conceptual. So, let's try to understand it. Open market operation, you understand, RBI buys and sells government securities. Now, here what happens? This is RBI, banks, and then in the next situation. So, under Operation Twist, what can you tell me what RBI wanted to achieve through Operation Twist? RBI wanted to bring down the long-term interest. RBI wanted to bring down the long-term interest in the economy through Operation Twist. So, how did it exactly, what exactly did? See, please listen carefully. Banks had cash for 1 year. Banks had cash for 1 year. Just assume that banks had cash for 1 year. So, banks could have lent only for 1 year time period or less than, or 1 year or less than 1 year, 6 months, 8 months, 9 months, 1 year. So, banks had cash, that means banks had liquidity for less than 1 year. So, banks could have lent for maximum 1 year or less than 1 year. So, short-term interest rate less than 1 year was quite low, was low enough in the economy, and banks had cash and banks were willing to lend for less than a year. But RBI wanted that long-term interest rates should come down in the economy to support growth. Long-term interest rate, RBI wanted to bring it down. Without pumping extra money in the economy, RBI wanted to bring down the long-term interest. That was the purpose of Operation Twist. Bring down the long-term interest without pumping extra liquidity. So, in case of Operation Twist, extra money has not been pumped into the economy, but RBI has been successful in bringing down the long-term interest rate. How? Let's see. So, banks had short-term liquidity, so short-term interest rate was low, but RBI wanted to bring down the long-term interest. So, what RBI did? RBI gave banks securities. RBI sold the securities of maturity 1 year, and RBI took the cash. So, RBI sold basically the securities, government securities, to banks. Now, listen carefully. Banks purchased this government securities maturing after 1 year. Why banks purchased? Because they had this cash for 1 year. So, even though they will purchase this government securities, they will earn interest on that, and after 1 year, they will get the cash back. So, they had cash for 1 year. So, basically, RBI took that cash from banks for 1 year. So, RBI took that cash for 1 year, and RBI gave a security, government security, which was maturing after 1 year. And anyways, banks were willing to give this money for 1 year. So they purchased the government securities which are maturing after 1 year. So after 1 year, they will get the cash, right? So the cash which RBI got, so what RBI did with this cash, RBI again paid the cash to banks and purchased government securities whose maturity was after 10 years. So government gave this cash and listen carefully, government purchased this security, government security which was maturing after 10 years. Now, so this banks had government securities maturing after 10 years. Government had these securities and RBI purchased these securities and gave cash. Listen carefully. When banks had these government securities which was maturing after 10 years, that means banks were expecting cash after 10 years. Banks were expecting cash on these bonds after 10 years. But when RBI purchased these securities and gave this cash, so banks got the cash right now. Banks were expecting cash after 10 years, but banks got the cash right now. So banks can do anything with this cash for the next 10 years because the requirement of cash was after 10 years, but banks got the cash right now. So the banks can lend this cash to anyone for the next 10 years. So when the banks have cash for the next 10 years which they can lend to anyone, the long-term interest in the market came down. Long-term interest rate in the market came down. This was Operation Twist. Not done generally, but it was done. So RBI did not. So whatever cash it took, let's say 10,000 crore, it pumped the same cash, not extra. This is Operation Twist. And in Operation Twist, RBI sells short-term securities and purchases long-term securities. Not the vice versa. Not the opposite. This was Operation Twist. Now another very important term, see what is happening with UPSC, that they are asking certain terms which was highlighted 2 years, 3 years back. So just don't stick to just 1 year or 10 months or time or just last previous year. If certain terms are quite highlighted, they are asking even if it was highlighted 2 years back or 3 years back. So this was a very much highlighted term in the COVID period, so you should understand that.